Armies, of course, undertake to do exactly that. That would seem to be the only sensible way of combating Argentinian scare propaganda and helping the anxious people back in Britain. Michael Nicholson, ITN, with the British task force off the Falkland Islands.
Michael Nicholson, reporting on Argentine war claims. That's it for the moment. We'll be back later. Good evening.
To a peaceful settlement of the crisis. He said that military pressure was not an end in itself, and that a peaceful and lasting settlement was required. Our solemn purpose, he said, was to achieve our military objectives by the use of minimum force. Every action will remain under the strictest political direction and control, he added. There'll be a full report on all the developments in the Falklands crisis in an A nuclear sub goes into action. Argentina's only cruiser is crippled and may be sunk. And a Lynx helicopter goes into action. An Argentine patrol boat is sunk. Call up for the QE2 and 3,000 more soldiers. The Defense Secretary says, I hope it won't be a bloody conflict. Good evening. There are reports tonight that Argentina's only cruiser, the second biggest ship in her navy, has now sunk. The cruiser, the General Belgrano, was struck by 2 torpedoes from a British nuclear submarine. At the time, it's thought there were 1,000 men on board. The Belgrano was known to have been severely damaged, and the news that she may actually have sunk came as Mr. John Nott, the Minister of Defence, was answering questions from reporters at the Ministry of Defence less than an hour ago. Britain has also sunk a patrol boat, a converted tug, and damaged another. Mr. Nott said the past week had been a notably successful one for British forces, but he said Britain's overriding aim would remain a peaceful and lasting settlement. I sincerely hope it will not be a long and bloody conflict, he added. Earlier, the government had announced the next stage in the military build-up. The QE2 has been called into service. She's due back at Southampton at midnight tonight, as well as another 2 ferries and a container ship. They'll be used to carry south the 3,000 men of 5 Infantry Brigade, who are on standby for the Falkland Islands. But first, the reports that the cruiser Belgrano has sunk in the South Atlantic. Here's a report from Christopher Morris in Buenos Aires.
The military junta, in a communique number 18 issued just a few minutes ago, said there were now indications that the General Belgrano has sunk. The last known position of the Argentine cruiser was given as 55 degrees 24 latitude south and 61 degrees 32 longitude west. There were no other details given, either about the 1,200 Argentine sailors aboard the warship or the huge sea search which has apparently been going on all day. According to military sources here, at least 5 Argentine warships have been taking part in this search. But if the cruiser has indeed gone down, the chances of the crew's survival would seem remote, after so many hours since the torpedo attack, with 30-foot waves reported and icy sea conditions. The junta confirmed the attack on the General Belgrano earlier this morning, saying that the cruiser had been damaged by a torpedo. Then no other details were given, whether there'd been any Argentine casualties or exactly how serious the damage was. The cruiser was commissioned 43 years ago and bought from the United States in 1951 for nearly £4 million.
There's been something of a lull in the fighting in the South Atlantic. It's now more than 17 hours since Britain sank an Argentine patrol boat within the exclusion zone, and more than 24 hours since the Royal Navy torpedoed the Belgrano just outside. For an account of these first naval battles of the conflict, our reporter with the task force, Brian Hanrahan, who sent us this dispatch before the announcement that the Belgrano may have sunk.
The cruiser had been operating outside Britain's 200-mile exclusion zone for several days. At 8 o'clock last night, a nuclear-powered submarine torpedoed it. It hasn't been sunk, but it has been damaged. The attack was selective. The cruiser's escorts were allowed to escape. The General Belgrano was an old World War II cruiser. It had 15 big guns and a crew of more than 1,000 to man them. Despite its firepower, it was perhaps the least worrying of the serious threats to the task force. Because of its age, it would make a great deal of noise in the water, an easy trace for Britain's nuclear hunter-killer submarines, which have been on station here for some time. The overnight skirmish began when a Sea King helicopter came across an Argentine patrol boat, a converted tug armed with a machine gun. The tug opened fire on the Sea King, which called in reinforcements. A Lynx helicopter armed with the latest radar-guided missile, a Sea Skua, attacked the tug and sunk it. Hermes called in another helicopter to search for survivors, but as it approached, it was fired on by another Argentine patrol boat. The Lynx attacked the second patrol boat with missiles and damaged it. A pilot who was in the air at the time in another helicopter monitored the action over his radio.
The Lynx helicopter then closed the hostile contact and attacked with two Sea Skua missiles. Shortly afterwards, he reported 2 missiles hit. He then went inbound to investigate the damage he'd caused. He then reported that the contact had sunk. A second Lynx helicopter was tasked to look for survivors. Whilst he was looking, he was fired upon by another contact. He was given permission to attack that contact and did. He was then asked to look for survivors, but being short of fuel, he then returned to his ship.
The task force has now dealt heavy blows at both the Argentine Navy and the Air Force, as well as bombing and damaging the airport at Port Stanley. So far, it's shown that it can enforce the sea and air blockade of the islands that Admiral Woodward, the commander, said he intended to establish. This demonstrates to the troops ashore that they cannot expect much in the way of reinforcement or help from the mainland if they decide to resist any British invasion. With winter closing in, much will now depend on what supplies and shelter they've managed to bring across to the island in the few weeks since they invaded. Brian Hanrahan, BBC, aboard HMS Hermes.
HMS Conqueror had been tracking the General Belgrano for some time. The nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarine carries a large number of Tigerfish torpedoes fired from 6 torpedo tubes. The Tigerfish can attack from a range of more than 30 miles, though it's likely Conqueror was a lot closer when she torpedoed the cruiser. The Belgrano was safe from immediate destruction by her thick belt of armour plating on the waterline, but for that there could have been heavy loss of life amongst her crew of 1,000 men. As yet we don't know exactly when she went down. Presumably her 2 escorting destroyers were able to go alongside to take off the survivors. 7 hours later and 400 miles north came the second incident. It's likely those patrol craft were trying to find out the precise position of the carrier group. Instead, they made history by becoming the first victims of the new Sea Skua anti-ship missile. The Sea Skua was designed for just this kind of mission, attacking marauding warships long before they reached the fleet. 2 Sea Skuas totally destroyed one Argentine vessel, and the other damaged vessel did have life rafts dropped alongside from helicopters. So, victory once again for the task force. But what Admiral Woodward needs to know is what that cruiser was doing so far south. Was it intended as a surprise attack on the task force off the Falklands or on South Georgia? And if those patrol boats were to the north, does that mean the Argentines are planning a combined attack using land-based aircraft, submarines, and the Argentine carrier Cinco de Mayo? Each commander is trying to foresee the other's next move, and so far Admiral Woodward has outguessed the Argentines.
A few minutes ago, the Defence Secretary John Nott gave his first news conference since the retaking of South Georgia more than a week ago. He said that the decision to send more troops to the South Atlantic was a prudent one, with the continuing prospect of conflict so far from Britain. Mr. Nott also reaffirmed Britain's commitment to seek a peaceful solution. But he had this warning for the Argentine government.
The Argentine government knows that there is one quick and simple way to avoid casualties to their personnel and loss of their ships and aircraft. It is to keep out of the zones declared by us and to cease threatening and attacking our forces in the South Atlantic. Furthermore, there is one quick and simple way to stop the fighting, and that is for them to take their garrison off the Falklands in compliance with United Nations Resolution 502. Then, negotiations for a peaceful long-term solution can be resumed. I do not pretend that our forces face an easy task. Early success is certainly encouraging. We are confident that our mission will be successful, but we will never be overconfident, nor will we boast of our successes. In conclusion, perhaps I can quote the most famous of all our naval heroes, Admiral Nelson, who said before Trafalgar, I believe, that magnanimity in victory will be the main aim of the British fleet. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes.
Mr. Nott was then asked a question about the British attack last night on the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano. Was this the minimum use of force to which the government's committed?
Well, as you will appreciate, if there is a threat to our own ships and to our own men, we have no possible option but to respond to that threat. Our first duty is to protect our own men, and the General Belgrano was a threat to our men, and therefore it was quite correct that she was attacked by our submarines.
Mr. Nott, BBC Television News, would you now accept that for all practical purposes Britain is engaged in a war with the Argentine?
Well, the term war has a legal connotation, and also it is used by laymen. Certainly we have hostilities with the Argentinians, that cannot be denied. It is not, in legal terms, war. We are engaged in hostilities, and we have the right of self-defense under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. That is strictly the legal position. But laymen, I agree with you entirely, most laymen would describe it as hostilities verging on war. I agree with that.
Do you not think that it will become a technical war?
I think that didn't the Argentinian Prime Minister use this phrase in New York? We are operating under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, exercising our right of self-defense. We did not fire the first shot. First shot was fired by the Argentinians in invading the islands.
The Argentine junta's account of the conflict has been strongly criticised by the Ministry of Defence in London. Their concern is that Argentine claims may worry families of men aboard the task force because it takes time to check the facts. And the ministry cite 4 examples of what they call fabrications by Argentina. The ministry say HMS Exeter was not involved in military operations. Argentine resistance on South Georgia is over. All task force aircraft are safe, and Port Stanley airfield is out of action.
My only point is that families and relatives of men aboard the task force may become worried by such reports from the Argentine, particularly since, on occasions, in order to provide fully authenticated statements, we in the Ministry of Defence have to check and recheck, and that takes time. You can be sure that our reports are true and as complete as we can make them.
The luxury liner, the QE2, is one of 4 more ships requisitioned by the Ministry of Defence to take troops and equipment to the Falklands. The others are 2 roll-on, roll-off ferries and a container ship. The ministry say the QE2 is uniquely suited to carrying a large number of troops and keeping them at readiness over a period of time. Bill Hamilton has been finding out why and talking to her captain.
The QE2 is tonight in home waters on her way back to Britain with 1,400 passengers, mostly American tourists. She's expected to sail into the Solent within the next couple of hours and is due to dock at Southampton around midnight. Her next cruise has been cancelled. The Ministry of Defence regret the inconvenience but insist the QE2's speed, size and facilities make her ideally suited as a troop carrier. I asked the ship's captain when he first heard of the Ministry's plans.
Well, Mr. Hamilton, I've just heard from you this very minute.
This is the first you've heard about it?
Yes, I haven't heard anything from anywhere else.
Well, the Ministry say they'd like her to carry an infantry brigade. Do you think this ship is suitable for this purpose?
Well, if the Ministry thinks so, I'm sure she must be. It's a total surprise to me. I hadn't even considered it.
Do you think you would be prepared to captain the ship on this voyage?
Oh, yes, indeed.
Do you think the QE2 would be in any danger at all around the Falkland Islands?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I'm a naval reservist as well as being captain of the ship, Mr. Hamilton, and I know our Navy is very good indeed.
The Scots and Welsh Guards and men of the Gurkha Rifles who make up 5 Infantry Brigade will find plenty of facilities for keeping fit on the liner Cunard Cole, the greatest in the world. Modifications, though, could take a little time, for much of her structure is aluminium and will need considerable strengthening to allow a helicopter pad to be fitted. The gymnasium and swimming pools will help keep the troops up to the mark. But just how much use they'll be allowed of the two nightclubs, casino and cocktail bars, is another matter. Till now, the only guns carried on the QE2 have been for the gentlemanly pursuit of clay pigeon shooting. A sailing date for the ship hasn't yet been fixed. Later this month, the QE2 was to have featured in a luxury package holiday, with passengers crossing the Atlantic in her to New York, spending 5 days there, returning on Concorde. And tomorrow she was due to sail on a Mediterranean cruise. Today, Cunard staff have been busy advising those passengers the cruise was off and telling them of the QE's new role. So what had been the reaction of those they'd contacted?
A certain amount of resignation, I think. We're trying to make them alternative arrangements. This is proving difficult today, but we hope that by tomorrow and Wednesday we'll have some options that they can take rather than cruise with us.
The Foreign Secretary, Mr. Pym, has arrived home after his talks in Washington and New York with the American Secretary of State and top United Nations officials. Mr. Pym said that when Britain succeeded in the Falklands crisis, and we intend to succeed, he said, the world would be a safer place. From New York, Michael Cole reports on Mr. Pym's discussions with the UN Secretary-General Pérez de Cuellar.
It was the first time the two men had met, Mr. Pym immediately informing the Secretary-General of the latest British naval action against the Argentine fleet. Mr. Pym went to the UN with no new diplomatic proposals, stressing at a press conference that first Argentina must withdraw from the islands.
Our strategy all along has been to maintain pressure on the Argentines, diplomatic, economic and military, and we declared several days ago the total exclusion zone which we are now going to protect. Yesterday there was a very real threat to that zone posed by a cruiser. There was also an attack on a helicopter from two ships which were immediately counterattacked by British forces. I want to make it clear that the British are not undertaking these military engagements by choice. We are there to defend British soil and British people, and we wish to go back to the negotiating table at which we were sitting very properly with Argentina before all this began.
At the end of a weekend of concerted military action, apparently successful from Britain's point of view, and your consultations in Washington and here, do you have any sense at all that you're closer to the end of hostilities, or do you feel that we are in for a protracted period of warfare?
I would hope we are nearer, but that is up to the Argentines and we must see. I would like to comment on your phrase concerted military activity. That military activity has been entirely directed to securing the total exclusive zone of which we gave notice. They started the aggression, the Argentines. They invaded the island first. It's British territory and there are British people there, and we have gone to defend them as we are entitled to do under the United Nations Charter.
So Mr. Pym got all that he hoped or expected from his visit to the United Nations. He put forcefully the uncompromising British view that Argentina must make the first move if there is to be peace.
Mr. Pym arrived home on Concorde just over an hour ago. He'd say no more than that it had been a useful visit. He went on to Downing Street. Tomorrow he'll meet the inner cabinet before the full cabinet meets in the morning, and it's expected he or Mrs. Thatcher will make a statement in the House of Commons later.
Mr. Pym will probably tell the inner cabinet that for the moment diplomacy has ground to a halt. United Nations Secretary-General de Cuellar told the Foreign Secretary that he had had a working party looking into ways his organisation could help, and they'd come to the conclusion the UN can do nothing for the moment. The time may come when some interim force or middleman is needed, and with the United States now obviously unacceptable to the Argentines as honest brokers, the UN might then have a role to play, but not for now. So that's one aspect of the government's three-phase strategy to regain the Falklands going through a somewhat stagnant stage. Of the others, economic sanctions are starting to bite. Buenos Aires is having problems because bankers are not anxious to lend to a country involved in a military conflict, but that takes time to have a real effect. And on the battlefront, the next moves are likely to be left to the junta. If the need arises, as the task force commanders decided it did last night when the Argentine cruiser was attacked, military action will be taken. But the phrase being used in Whitehall at the moment is, let them stew a bit.
The Labour leader Michael Foot has explained why he won't take part in private talks with the Prime Minister about the crisis. Mr Foot said the House of Commons was the proper place for such discussions. MPs should be given the fullest possible reports on the latest diplomatic moves. David Steele for the Liberals and Dr David Owen for the SDP have already agreed to meet Mrs Thatcher. She'll now have to decide whether the talks should go ahead without Mr Foot. And now other news. In Poland, riot police used water cannon, tear gas and batons to break up a large anti-government demonstration in central Warsaw. Tim Sebastian, just returned from Poland, has been watching the film of the day's dramatic events.
Nearly 5 months into martial law, and the police shaped up for one of the worst riots the capital had seen for years. In the old town was one man whose spirit hung over the entire demonstration, Lech Wałęsa, interned, isolated, but not forgotten. The fighting broke out after police had ordered the crowds to disperse and had been met with open defiance. Well over 10,000 had forced their way into the old town. The Solidarity banners were back, so was the anger and the bitterness. This was the day Solidarity tried to hold up its head, and this is what it got in return. Tonight, state television suggested that similar scenes had taken place in other parts of the country, probably in the Baltic port of Gdansk. Ironically, elsewhere in Warsaw, Parliament was debating the topic of national reconciliation. There wasn't much sign of it out on the streets. So far, there are still no reports of casualties, although eyewitnesses said some bystanders had been beaten up and police truncheons weren't there for decoration. As police broke up some demonstrations, other people regrouped elsewhere. Some chanted the national anthem, others shouted Gestapo. Many of the government leaders had begun talking about normalization. They'd eased the curfew and released detainees. Now they may be thinking again. Among the demonstrators, the students were the most active. More than 1,500 of them confronted the police for more than an hour. The underground has said that if Solidarity is disbanded, not just suspended, there could be more demonstrations of this kind and more resistance. Clearly a sign the government can't ignore. Well, tonight the telephone communications with Warsaw were suspended to all but government traffic, and there are suggestions that the nighttime curfew, eased only yesterday, could be reinstated. Other tough measures could also be imposed. For the people, the token relaxation had come too late, and the government now has ample proof that martial law has solved little. But it isn't just internally that Poland has its worries. The country's leader, General Jaruzelski, has spent the last few weeks assuring his East Bloc allies that he has the situation under control. Today's incidents will have seriously undermined his credibility.
At home, nearly 60 people were treated in hospital in South Humberside after a temporary grandstand collapsed during filming for the BBC television series It's a Knockout. More than 500 spectators were in the stand at Normanby Park near Scunthorpe when, in the words of one of them, the whole thing buckled with a noise like thunder. Exactly why it happened is unclear, but the wind had been gusting to gale force throughout the day. One man described how he suddenly found himself buried underneath other people. And It's a Knockout competitors helped to pull free children and other spectators trapped under a tangle of wood and steel. Of those taken to hospital, many have already been allowed home, and it's now established no one was seriously injured. However, there are at least 4 people with suspected fractures. Police in Cornwall have still found no trace of the 3 local youngsters last seen near Penzance Harbour on Friday. The search has continued at sea and inland for the 3, one of them 11-year-old Kirk Peters, a spina bifida victim who made headlines 2 years ago when he wrote a letter of encouragement to a young London policeman injured by a bomb. With Kirk were his 14-year-old brother and a friend who's 19. The 4 scouts missing overnight on Snowdon were found alive this morning. They were said to be bewildered but unharmed after surviving the sudden wintry storms which yesterday claimed the life of one of their companions. The story of a weekend that went tragically wrong, from Elvin Thomas.
40 scouts had got onto the mountain in reasonable weather, but by Sunday night the expedition had been turned into a shambles by Arctic weather. One boy, Neil Apley, aged 16, from Walsall, died from hypothermia last night, and several others had suffered from severe exposure. Neil Apley tried to shelter with a younger boy inside a survival bag, and today the rescued 13-year-old told relatives of the dead boy what went wrong. The sub-zero wind on the mountain was extreme. Rescuers had to crawl for fear of being blown off, but for some unknown reason the dead boy and his friend were huddled together right on top of a ridge in the teeth of the icy gale and torrential rain. Rescuers found both boys soaked to the skin, the survivor in light and inadequate wetproofs, and the dead boy with no wetproofs at all. Rescuers said had they sought shelter they might have survived. As it was, the 4 scouts still missing this morning had done just that. They'd pitched their tent in a small valley out of the wind, and when a rescue helicopter found them, they were very cold, but otherwise unharmed.
And once again, tonight's development in the Falklands crisis that the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano is believed to have sunk about 24 hours after being torpedoed by a British submarine in the South Atlantic. The news came in a communique tonight from the Argentine Joint Chiefs of Staff in Buenos Aires. They said, indications exist to make us presume it sank. The General Belgrano was hit just outside the 200-mile exclusion zone around the Falklands by the nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarine HMS Conqueror. Here again is our defence correspondent, Christopher Wayne.
Although so far there's still no positive confirmation that the General Belgrano has gone down, it is known that she took 2 hits from heavyweight tigerfish torpedoes, and that kind of damage in winter seas off Tierra del Fuego makes it unlikely she remained afloat for long. The loss of life would be heavy. Torpedo strikes distort ships, and escape doors can be jammed. Magazines can catch fire, engine rooms can be flooded. But she did have 2 escort destroyers, and provided they were able to close, the death toll will have been reduced. For the Argentine Navy, the loss of this ship would be more than the mere destruction of a cruiser which survived Pearl Harbor. It would be the loss of firepower and of a big ship which could have threatened the task force. Above all, it would be a loss of face for the Argentine Navy. Whether that will cause them to be more cautious with their remaining fleet or to go all out to avenge the loss of the cruiser is another matter.
And the other Falklands headlines, Lynx helicopters have sunk one Argentine patrol boat and damaged another. The QE2 has been requisitioned for the task force and will sail with 3,000 more soldiers to the Falklands. And finally, from Argentina, the plight of 17,000 Britons who've opted to stay in their adopted country. As the conflict deepens, more and more of them are becoming increasingly worried. Christopher Morris explains.
For the Britons who ignored the warnings and stayed behind in Argentina, these are now worrying times. The outbreak of fighting has deeply affected all of them. So they crowded into the little Anglican church of St. Michael's in Buenos Aires for a special service to pray for peace.
We pray especially for the leaders of Argentina and Great Britain, that they may follow the path of peace.
There were prayers too for those who've already been killed or wounded in the conflict, and for the husbands and sons now serving with the Argentine forces or those about to be called up for war. Should the fighting escalate, these Britons fear what might happen to them. Already some Argentine friends have turned against them, and there have been death threats against British families. Mostly their loyalties to Britain remain, but a majority of the 17,000 British residents still want to stay in their adopted country.
At the moment, I'm utterly broken-hearted. I can't bear the thought of an Argentine being killed by a Britisher, because my feelings are entirely towards the Argentine and my blood is British.
And that's the news tonight.